Most people believe discipline is about forcing yourself to do things you don't want to do. They wake up every morning believing the strongest people on earth simply have more motivation, more willpower, more self-control. But what if everything you've been taught about discipline is wrong? What if the people who appear unbreakable aren't stronger than you at all? What if they simply stopped fighting themselves? Imagine waking up tomorrow without arguing with your own mind. No internal debate. No, I'll start on Monday. No, just 5 more minutes. No endless cycle of motivation followed by guilt. Just action. Quiet. Effortless. Automatic action. It sounds impossible because you've spent your entire life believing that success belongs to people who can force themselves to suffer. But centuries ago, long before neuroscience existed, before psychologists studied habits, before productivity became a billion-dollar industry, a small group of monks living deep within the mountains of Japan discovered something modern science is only beginning to understand. They weren't trying to become successful. They weren't chasing money, status, or recognition. They were searching for mastery over the human mind, and what they discovered was far more dangerous than motivation. Because motivation fades, emotions change, inspiration disappears, but they created something that survives all of it. A system capable of transforming ordinary people into individuals who simply never stop. The strange part is that this system doesn't begin by teaching you discipline. It begins by destroying the person you believe you are, because the greatest obstacle standing between you and the life you want isn't laziness. It isn't procrastination. It isn't even fear. It's your identity. Every morning, without realizing it, you wake up and replay the same invisible story. You tell yourself you're someone who struggles with consistency, someone who always starts strong but eventually gives up, someone who wants change but somehow never becomes the person they imagine. The frightening truth is that your brain believes every word of that story. Neuroscientists call this predictive processing. Your brain isn't simply reacting to reality, it's constantly predicting who you are, and then forcing your behavior to match those predictions. In other words, before you even open your eyes each morning, your mind has already decided how today will end. That's why people repeat the same mistakes for years. They're not trapped by circumstances. They're trapped by an identity they've rehearsed thousands of times. But there was once a young architect named Ethan who knew nothing about any of this. On paper, his life looked impressive. A good career, a comfortable apartment, friends who admired his potential, yet every night he carried the same silent disappointment. Shelves filled with unfinished books, workout equipment collecting dust, business ideas abandoned after 2 weeks, goals written in expensive journals that were never opened again. Every January he became a new person. Every February he became the old one again. He downloaded habit trackers, bought productivity courses, watched motivational videos before bed. For a few days everything changed. Then life returned to normal. Until one winter evening, while walking home after another exhausting day, Ethan noticed an old bookstore hidden between 2 buildings he had passed hundreds of times without ever seeing. Curiosity pulled him inside. The place was almost silent. Dust floated through the warm light. Ancient wooden shelves reached toward the ceiling, filled with books that looked older than the city itself. Behind the counter sat an elderly Japanese man reading quietly. Without looking up, he asked, "What are you trying to become?" Ethan smiled awkwardly, more disciplined. The old man finally looked at him and said something Ethan would remember for the rest of his life. "Then you are already chasing the wrong thing." Confused, Ethan laughed. "Isn't discipline exactly what I need?" The old man slowly closed his book. "No. Discipline is only the shadow. Identity is the source." Ethan frowned. He had expected advice about routines, productivity, or morning habits. Instead, he was being told that everything he believed about self-improvement was backwards. The old man stood and walked toward a shelf, removing a small black notebook with faded pages. He placed it on the counter. "Tell me," he asked, "if a man believes he is weak, how long can he pretend to be strong?" Ethan didn't answer. "Eventually," the old man continued, "his actions returned to match his identity, always." He opened the notebook and pointed to a sentence written in Japanese ink. Beneath it was an English translation. "Every action you repeat is a vote for the person you believe yourself to be." Ethan stared at the words. The old man continued, "Most people try to change their behavior before changing the person performing that behavior. They are building a house while refusing to change the foundation." For the first time in years, Ethan felt something different. Not motivation, not excitement. Curiosity, real curiosity, because deep down he knew something was wrong with the endless cycle he'd been living. The old man smiled gently and asked one final question before closing the notebook. If I asked you to describe yourself in one sentence, what would you say? Ethan answered without thinking, I'm someone who never stays consistent. The old man's smile disappeared. Then why are you surprised your life keeps proving you right? Silence filled the room. Ethan couldn't answer because somewhere inside him. He realized he'd never actually failed because he lacked discipline. He failed because every decision he made was secretly protecting the identity he already believed was true. And that single realization would lead him toward an ancient system almost no one alive truly understands. A system that doesn't teach you how to build habits. It teaches you how to become someone who no longer needs them. That night, Ethan walked home carrying nothing except one sentence echoing inside his mind. Identity comes first, everything else follows. He had no idea that this simple idea would completely dismantle the life he thought he understood. Because the next lesson wouldn't ask him to work harder. It would ask him to kill the version of himself that had been quietly controlling every decision for years. And almost nobody is prepared for what happens when that process begins. The following morning, Ethan woke up exactly as he had every other morning. The alarm rang. His hand reached for the phone. His mind immediately began its familiar negotiation. You're tired. 5 more minutes won't matter. You'll start tomorrow. Normally, this conversation would have lasted several minutes before ending with the same result. But something was different. Instead of arguing with the voice, Ethan simply watched it. For the first time, he realized something terrifying. Those thoughts weren't commands, they were predictions. His brain wasn't telling him the truth. It was repeating the identity it had practiced for years. That single realization created a tiny space between who he was and who he believed he was. It was the smallest crack imaginable, but sometimes a single crack is enough to bring down an entire wall. Later that evening, Ethan returned to the bookstore, hoping the old man would still be there. He was, sitting in exactly the same chair, reading exactly the same way. Without lifting his eyes from the page, he said, "You came back because your mind is louder today than yesterday." Ethan froze. "How did you know?" The old man smiled. "Because every identity fights for survival." He closed the book and motioned for Ethan to sit. People think change is difficult because building new habits is hard. That's only half the truth. The real difficulty is that every new habit threatens the identity your brain has spent years protecting. Ethan listened silently. The old man picked up a small wooden chess piece from the counter. "Tell me," he asked, "does this pawn ever wonder if it should become a knight?" Ethan shook his head. "No, why not?" "Because it's a pawn." The old man nodded slowly. "Exactly. Identity removes negotiation." He placed the pawn back on the board. "Now imagine you secretly replaced it with a queen while everyone was asleep. Would the queen wake up wondering if it should move like a pawn?" Ethan smiled. "Of course not. Then understand this," the old man said, leaning forward. "The strongest people you've ever admired are not constantly making better decisions. They're making decisions that match who they believe they already are." Ethan felt a chill run through him. Because for years, he had tried to force himself to behave like a disciplined person while continuing to believe he was inconsistent. It was like asking a pawn to move like a queen without ever changing the piece. The old man reached beneath the counter and placed a blank sheet of paper in front of Ethan. "Write one sentence." Ethan picked up the pen. "What sentence?" The old man replied quietly, "Not who you are today. Write who you intend to become." Ethan hesitated before writing slowly, "I'm a man who always finishes what he starts." The old man looked at the sentence for several seconds before sliding it back toward him. "Read it again." Ethan did. "Now," the old man continued, "your brain rejects it." Ethan laughed. "Because it isn't true." "No," the old man corrected, "because it isn't familiar." That answer stayed with Ethan long after he left the bookstore. Familiar, not true. Familiar. Modern neuroscience has repeatedly shown that the human brain values familiarity more than improvement. Even painful routines can feel safer than positive change because the brain prefers predictable suffering over unpredictable growth. That's why people remain in unhealthy relationships, stay in jobs they hate, repeat destructive habits, and return to lives they promised themselves they had already escaped. The known feels safer than the unknown, even when the known is slowly destroying them. Over the next few days, Ethan stopped chasing motivation. Instead, he began observing himself like a scientist. Every excuse, every delay, every promise of later. He noticed that each one followed the exact same pattern. First came a feeling, then a thought that justified the feeling, then an action that protected his old identity. It happened so quickly he had never noticed it before. One rainy afternoon, while watching people rush through the city streets, he suddenly understood something profound. Every human being lives inside invisible stories. Some people wake up believing they are leaders. Others wake up believing they are victims. Some believe they are strong. Others believe they are broken. And without realizing it, they spend every single day collecting evidence to prove those stories correct. Your brain behaves less like a camera recording reality, and more like a lawyer defending the identity you've already accepted. It ignores evidence that challenges your story while magnifying everything that confirms it. Ethan finally understood why years of motivation had never changed him. Every motivational video temporarily changed his emotions, but none of them changed the story his brain was protecting. The following week, the old man introduced him to the first principle of an ancient practice that had survived for centuries. "Never ask yourself what you feel like doing," he said calmly. "Ask yourself what the person you are becoming would do." At first, the exercise felt artificial. Every decision required conscious effort. When Ethan wanted to skip reading, he paused and asked, "What would the man who always finishes what he starts do?" When he wanted to ignore the gym, he asked the same question. When he wanted to procrastinate on difficult work, the question returned again. Slowly, something strange began happening. The answers stopped feeling forced. They began arriving automatically, not because the tasks became easier, but because his identity was quietly shifting beneath the surface. Weeks passed. His friends noticed subtle changes. He spoke differently, walked differently, complained less, finished more, yet Ethan himself didn't feel extraordinary. He still experienced resistance. He still felt tired. He still had moments of doubt. The difference was that doubt no longer controlled his actions. He had discovered something most people never realize. Confidence doesn't create action. Action creates confidence, and identity grows through repeated evidence, not repeated affirmations. Every completed promise became another brick in the foundation of his new identity. Every small victory whispered to his subconscious, "This is who we are now." But just when Ethan believed he understood the system, life decided to test whether his transformation was real, or whether he had simply built another fragile layer of temporary motivation. Because anyone can remain disciplined when life is easy. The real question is, who are you when everything begins to fall apart? 3 months later, everything Ethan had built was challenged in a single week. His company announced unexpected layoffs. Projects disappeared overnight. Friends he'd worked beside for years packed their desks in silence. Every conversation in the office carried the same invisible emotion: fear. For the first time in months, Ethan felt the old voice return. "What's the point? Your future isn't even certain anymore. Skip today. Rest. Start again when life becomes stable." It was the exact voice that had defeated him hundreds of times before, but something extraordinary happened. He didn't argue with it. He didn't fight it. He simply smiled, because he finally understood something that had taken him nearly 30 years to learn. That voice wasn't trying to help him. It wasn't protecting him. It was protecting the old version of him. Fear had lost its authority the moment he stopped treating every thought as truth. Instead of skipping his morning routine, he completed it exactly as planned. 20 minutes of reading, 20 minutes of training, 10 minutes of silent reflection, nothing spectacular, nothing heroic, just another ordinary day. Yet it was on that ordinary day that Ethan realized extraordinary people are built, not during moments of inspiration, but during moments when nobody is watching and every excuse feels completely reasonable. A few weeks later, the layoffs reached his department. Ethan lost his job. In the past, this would have destroyed every habit he had built. He would have slept until noon, ignored his routines, drowned himself in distractions, and convinced himself he would rebuild once life became easier. But this time, something was different. The morning after losing everything, his alarm rang at exactly the same time. Without hesitation, he stood up, not because he felt strong, but because the decision had already been made long before the problem existed. That's the difference between people who rely on motivation and people who rely on identity. Motivation asks, how do I feel today? Identity asks, who am I becoming? And once your identity answers that question, emotions become almost irrelevant. Days turned into weeks. Ethan searched for work every afternoon, but every morning remained untouched. His routine became the only thing in his life that uncertainty couldn't steal. Eventually, something unexpected began happening. The discipline he had built wasn't simply helping him achieve goals. It was changing the way other people reacted to him. During interviews, employers noticed a calm confidence they couldn't explain. Friends began asking how he stayed so composed despite losing his job. Even his family commented that he seemed different, not happier, not louder, simply steadier. That's because true discipline isn't loud, it doesn't announce itself. It reveals itself through consistency. Most people mistake confidence for charisma. In reality, confidence is often nothing more than accumulated evidence. Every promise you keep to yourself becomes another reason your brain begins trusting you again. And trust changes everything. Because once you trust yourself, fear loses its greatest weapon. You stop wondering whether you'll quit halfway. You stop doubting your ability to survive discomfort. You stop negotiating with temporary emotions because you've proven to yourself, over and over again, that your actions no longer depend on them. Months passed, and Ethan eventually found a better position than the one he had lost. Higher salary, better environment, greater responsibility. Yet strangely, none of those achievements felt like his greatest victory. His greatest victory happened quietly one ordinary Tuesday morning. He finished his workout, closed the final page of his book, poured a cup of coffee, and suddenly realized something. He couldn't remember the last time he had argued with himself. The internal battle that had consumed almost his entire adult life had disappeared. It hadn't been defeated by force. It had simply starved to death. Every day he chose action over negotiation, the old identity became weaker. Every repeated behavior strengthened the new one. And eventually the war ended because there was no longer anyone left inside him defending the old version of himself. That realization brought him back to the bookstore one final time. The old man was sitting exactly where he always had been. Ethan smiled before speaking. "I think I understand now." The old man looked at him carefully. "Then tell me, what is discipline?" Ethan answered without hesitation. "Discipline isn't forcing yourself to act, it's becoming someone who no longer needs convincing." For the first time since they had met, the old man laughed. "Good," he said. "Now you're finally ready for the last lesson." Ethan leaned forward. The old man pointed toward the window where people hurried through the streets, chasing deadlines, dreams, and distractions. "Look at them," he whispered. "Most of them believe they're searching for a better life. They're not. They're searching for a better version of themselves. They think more money will solve it, more motivation, more knowledge, more confidence. But they keep trying to improve a person they've never stopped identifying with. That's why change never lasts." He paused before saying something Ethan would carry forever. People don't rise to the level of their goals. They fall to the level of the identity they practice every day. Ethan remained silent. Deep inside, he knew the old man wasn't only talking about him. He was talking about every human being who had ever promised to change, and quietly returned to old habits because they never changed the story running beneath those habits. As Ethan stood to leave, the old man handed him the same blank notebook he had seen months earlier. "Keep it," he said. Ethan looked confused. "What's inside?" The old man smiled. "Nothing." Ethan flipped through the empty pages. "It's blank." "Exactly," the old man replied. "Every morning before the world tells you who you are, before your fears speak, before your excuses begin, you decide what gets written." Ethan closed the notebook slowly. He finally understood. Identity isn't discovered, it's written, line by line, decision by decision. Day after day, and every single action is another sentence in the story your future self will one day call a life. As Ethan walked into the morning sunlight, the city looked exactly the same. The streets hadn't changed. The buildings hadn't changed. The people rushing past him hadn't changed. The only thing that had changed was the person observing it all, and sometimes, that's the only change that has ever truly mattered. But before Ethan reached the end of the street, he heard the old man's voice one last time. One final question. Ethan turned around. If everything you've learned disappeared tomorrow, if every book you've read vanished, if every lesson you remember was erased, what would remain? Ethan stood silently. The old man answered for him. Only your identity. Those words echoed inside Ethan's mind long after he had walked away. For years, he believed knowledge changed people. Then he believed motivation changed people. Then he believed discipline changed people. Now he understood something almost no one ever realizes. Identity changes everything. Because knowledge without identity becomes entertainment. Motivation without identity becomes emotion. Discipline without identity becomes suffering. But identity transforms behavior without force. It quietly rewrites the future one decision at a time. That night Ethan couldn't sleep, not because he was anxious, but because he kept replaying his entire life. He remembered every abandoned goal, every unfinished project, every promise he made to himself. Every Monday he said, "This time will be different." He suddenly realized nothing had ever been different. The only thing changing was the date on the calendar. The person making those promises had always remained the same, and expecting different results from the same identity was the greatest illusion he'd ever believed. For the next several months, he stopped chasing achievements completely. He stopped counting streaks, stopped checking productivity apps, stopped looking for motivation. Instead, he asked himself one question every single morning. Who deserves to exist today? Not, what do I have to accomplish? Not, how do I feel? Only, who am I becoming? It felt strange at first, almost uncomfortable, because the world trains people to measure success through results, money, followers, awards, recognition, but none of those things exist without behavior, and behavior never lasts unless identity supports it. Slowly, his mornings became quieter, the internal arguments disappeared, the emotional roller coaster settled. His attention grew sharper, his thoughts became slower, even time itself felt different, because once your mind stops negotiating every decision, life becomes astonishingly simple. 1 year later, Ethan returned to the bookstore. The lights were off, dust covered the windows, the wooden sign had been removed. He asked nearby shop owners what had happened. One elderly woman looked at him with surprise. "You knew him?" Ethan nodded. She smiled softly. "He passed away last winter." For a long moment, Ethan said nothing. The strange part wasn't sadness, it was gratitude, because he realized something. The old man had never tried to teach him productivity. He had never tried to teach him discipline. He had simply reminded him of something every human being forgets. You become what you repeatedly practice, not what you dream about, not what you admire, not what you post online, only what you repeatedly practice. Ethan walked away from the bookstore carrying the same blank notebook. He had filled only half of its pages, not with goals, not with motivational quotes, not with plans, but with evidence. Tiny promises kept, ordinary mornings completed, small victories no one else had seen, because those invisible victories had quietly built a completely different human being. Years passed. People often asked Ethan for advice. Some wanted to know how to become disciplined. Others asked how to stay motivated. Young entrepreneurs wanted productivity hacks. Athletes wanted mental toughness. Students wanted better focus. He always smiled. Because they were asking the wrong question, he would hand them the same notebook. Open to the very first page, there was only one sentence. Stop trying to change your life. Change the person living it. Most people looked confused, some nodded politely, very few understood, because human beings are addicted to external solutions, new books, new routines, new diets. New calendars, new goals, new apps, new strategies, everything new, except themselves, and that's why most change never survives years later. Ethan stood on a mountain overlooking the city where his journey had begun. The skyline looked smaller now, the streets seemed quieter. The problems that once consumed him felt almost invisible. He closed his eyes. The wind moved gently across the mountains. For a moment, everything became completely silent. Then he finally understood the greatest lesson of all. The strongest people in the world aren't those who never feel fear. They're the ones whose identity is stronger than their emotions. Fear still visits them, doubt still whispers, pain still arrives, failure still knocks on the door, but none of those guests are allowed to stay, because identity has already decided who lives in that house. Modern neuroscience has discovered something extraordinary. Every decision you repeat strengthens specific neural pathways. Eventually, those pathways become your default reality. Your future isn't created by one massive decision. It's quietly constructed by thousands of invisible ones. Every promise you keep, every excuse you reject, every uncomfortable action you complete. is another vote for the person you're becoming, and eventually, the votes become impossible to ignore. One day, you wake up and realize you're no longer trying to become disciplined. You simply are. No applause. No dramatic transformation. No magical breakthrough. Just a quiet morning, where doing the right thing feels more natural than avoiding it. That is the moment your old identity dies, not with pain, not with violence, but with silence, because the person who needed motivation no longer exists. The person who searched for confidence has disappeared. The person who constantly negotiated with himself has quietly faded away. In his place stands someone different, someone who keeps promises, someone who finishes what they start, someone whose actions no longer depend on feelings, someone who has become impossible to stop. So before you close this video, before you return to your ordinary life, ask yourself one question, not, what goal do I want to achieve? Ask something much more dangerous. Who am I becoming every time I repeat today's choices? Because your future isn't waiting somewhere ahead of you, it's being written right now by the identity you're practicing today, and maybe the life you've been searching for has never been hiding in better habits, better motivation, or better discipline. Maybe it has been waiting for a different version of you to finally appear. When that version arrives, success is no longer something you chase. It becomes something that quietly follows you, because the person capable of creating it already exists. The question is no longer whether you can change your life. The only question that remains is whether you're finally ready to become someone your old self would never recognize. The choice, as it has always been, is yours.